Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Coaching Outdoors podcast. As usual, I'm up here in the Highlands of Scotland. Anna Marie is down in Wiltshire, and we are joined today by the inimitable Chris Grimes. And I would like Chris to introduce himself to our listeners.
Well, hello. It's a complete delight and a joy and a breath of fresh air and outdoors, see what I'm doing there, to be here.
And Chris, whereabouts are you in the world?
I'm based in Bristol, which obviously you may know is 100 miles west of London, just to give people a pinning a ponytail on a map. But yes, I live in an area called Southville in Bristol, which is just behind the docks of Bristol.
Ah, beautiful. That's not too far from wonderful Wiltshire, which is where I reside.
We like that. Wonderful Wiltshire.
Of course.
And brilliant Bristol. No pressure, Alexandra. You've got to come up with an acronym of your own now.
Awesome Argyle. There you go.
So Chris, just kind of taking it back, it would be great to learn about your earliest memory, or what you believe is your earliest memory of being outdoors, and why do you enjoy being out there so much?
Oh, what a great question. And wow, it would be Uganda, where I grew up between my being 2.5 and 10. And it was a thunder and lightning storm, and it's one of my very, very first memories. And my mother was in the garden, and I was terrified of thunderstorms. And I would always have this slightly weird habit of dashing to my mum and holding onto her leg. Often that would involve me running up her skirt, to get hold of her leg and quake, because it really would thunder, and be very sort of tempestuous. And then why I have this memory is the thunderstorm clap happened. I dashed, ran up the leg, and was confronted with a gusset I didn't recognise, and then came out from underneath the dress, and it was like, hashtag awkward didn't even exist then. But that was a bit of a realisation that I've got to watch where I go during a thunderstorm, was the punchline. But it was in a place called Butiki in Uganda, near to a place called Ginger, where I live, which is 50 miles away from Kampala.
I must admit, I've seen some videos of the thunderstorms that happen in Africa, or all over Africa, and I don't think they compare to anywhere else in the world, do they? It seems like they are, like you said, tempestuous and just hugely loud. And I think it sounds to me like nature at its absolute rawest. It's just really as natural as you can possibly get.
And there's another memory linked to the rain in Africa. That sounds like I'm going to burst into Toto. We miss the rains down in Africa. But there was a time when we went to visit the line of the equator, and there was a road where there was almost like a yellow line showing that this is the equatorial part of Africa. And it was a mad rainstorm, but the rain was like a sheet. It literally stopped and started. And because we were near the equator and had this sense of cross the line, I remember standing literally with a rain shower dividing me in half, and having that extraordinary experience.
I can almost read Anna Marie's mind here. That sounds like liminal spaces to me. That sounds like a perfect divide between the rain and not rain, and the sort of that's the first thought that came into my mind there.
There's a lovely parallel, sorry to interrupt you, about coaching there, about the idea of crossing the line to connect and stepping into the world of your audience. And now I'm an actor by training and background as well. It's that very clear demarcation point between an off-stage moment and an on-stage moment. When we're on, when our presence is required, and when it's not. There are all sorts of nature parallels, but also, linked to the work that we so enjoy doing as well.
And that's a wonderful little segue actually into another question we always ask all of our guests at the very sort of start of the podcast is what is your backstory? How have you ended up where you are now? How have you ended up as a coach? I mean, you've got so many strings to your bow. So it'd be great to just give our listeners and our watchers just a flavour of all the different things you do and how you've ended up where you are with all the different aspects of your career.
Sure. Well, I'm a drama teacher, an actor, and a comedy improvisation performer by training and background. That sounds easy to say, but that was a path and a journey of probably about 20 years, in that I wanted to be an actor, and I followed my father's advice. He's still alive, he's 85, and as he's still alive, I've been able to thank him ever since for the wise sage-like advice about, if you want to be an actor, be a teacher first, and that'll give you something to fall back on. My father is a teacher. My daughter now is training to be a primary school teacher, which was going way back to her journey, beginning of lining her toys up with lesson plans. So she's got it in her DNA, as I think I probably do as well. But I'm very grateful to my father's advice, because I trained as a drama teacher first at the Central School of Screech and Trauma, as it's sometimes called, the Central School of Speech and Drama. Then I actor trained at the Old Vic Theatre School. And then I got into comedy improvisation, and then actually got into corporate training because of using a bit of comedy to cut through some of the drier aspects of corporate life, not in an irreverent way, but actually moving towards where I am now. It's all a path, and as we know, if you look over your shoulder, you can join the dots up backwards on your journey to now. And I use all three performance disciplines now and apply them to my newest project, which is pulling me towards my future, which is an energetic space called The Clearing, which is an oxygenated place where anything is possible, which is linked to comedy improvisation. Yes and, yes and, yes and as a mindset. But it's also the anchor point of my podcast, where I use The Clearing as a place to coach in as well, actually.
And it's always fascinating hearing people's backstories and the different career paths that they have to get to this moment in time. And as you say, with hindsight, you kind of look back and all the dots kind of line up and it makes sense. Though often at that time, when you don't have that future space visibility, it can just be so challenging and tricky, and you just don't know where you're going, and it just doesn't make sense, and you've maybe gone down completely the wrong career path, and what relevance is it now? And I find, a lot of our listeners and watchers, they're kind of, they're thirsty for this. Well, what next? I want to bring this passion in and this passion in, and let's learn from others. And the fact that you have this kind of comedy piece and laughter, laughter and comedy, and the idea of playfulness and taking things lightly is something that we often kind of seem to forget at the moment. We have to be very serious and we need to work really, really hard. It's all about productivity and focus. And this whole kind of idea of bringing humor and joy, into the whole communications training, leadership and coaching. It would just be great to hear a little bit more about this.
Well, I'm always nudging at people to get them to remember to enjoy yourself when you're communicating, because why wouldn't you? Because communication skills is an athletic activity. It requires focus, energy, and commitment. But you must enjoy yourself, because the human condition is full of slapstick, foibles, adversity, conflict, and comedy. And even the pandemic for everybody, which has been incredibly testing. I found comedy within that, a bit like a sort of golden thread in the darkness. I was reading quite a dark but cathartic, because it was off in the long grass, a dark book about the cartel. But within it was this extraordinary, a really brilliant trilogy by Dan Wilmslow about the cartel. It's an incredibly, deep, tense, tricky terrain he's describing. But the gold that suddenly surfaced, which helped with my podcast actually, was a quote about comedy, which is, we have to laugh because laughter, as we already know, is the first evidence of freedom. And so finding a way of just finding a sense of humor in the darkness is a really good way to remember that you can begin to replot your coordinates from that point. And I just love comedy, and even slapstick is laughing at other people's misfortune. I don't mean that unkindly, but going back to Uganda again, to this day, Stan Laurel really helps me as a bit of a style guide, almost like a sort of spirit guide, if you like, because I was 7 years old living in Uganda, a black and white TV set hummed into action, on walked Stan Laurel, part of Laurel and Hardy. And I was it stopped me in my tracks about, wow, just look at how beautifully humble, kind, hysterically funny this lovely human being is. And so to this day, he reminds me similarly to use comedy to keep it kind, to keep it humble, and to keep it respectful, without being we all know people who can assume that you need to be a bit of an a-hole to get on, but I really think kindness is the best way.
And thinking about the kind of, very much for a podcast about the outdoors and nature, and kind of getting that connection between laughter the outdoor space and the benefits of that, and how do you see that kind of blend together?
Well, in all the outdoor coaching that we all enjoy, and I know you've had the wonderful Dave Stewart as a previous guest here, and I work alongside Dave as a bit of a sort of Sherpa with a flip chart. I don't literally have a flip chart, but I've got a mind full of, random facts pertaining to how I can help you when I'm coaching you. It's a bit like I'm called a Sherpa with a flip chart because I can metaphorically carry your baggage for you as we're walking along. And the rhythm of a group as it's walking towards somewhere can sometimes evoke its own comedy anyway. There are moments of slapstick when someone might sort of stumble and try and make it look like they meant to do that, which goes right back to slipping on a banana skin almost. But also some symbolic, really funny stuff can happen. On a recent walk, somebody's soul became detached. You'll see where I'm going here with the storytelling metaphor, that the boot, as often happens when people don't get their walking boots out for years on end, someone's soul became detached. And so I was walking next to thinking, oh, that's interesting. What does that tell you then? That your soul's become detached? And we laughed about it. But actually, they were finding a real breakthrough in the oxygenation of the walk, which happened over, 3 days and 4 nights. And actually, it wasn't their soul was becoming detached. They were actually finding more of a soul chime, reconnecting to the great outdoors again. So that was a moment of great comedy and actually something that person will probably never forget. And nor me, because it was just a really wonderful exchange of being truly present with each other when that slightly comedy moment happened. And they literally had to hop for the last, and we sort of helped carry them down the mountain, if you like, metaphorically. Sorry, we literally carried them down the mountain. We didn't metaphorically do that.
You mentally supported them.
Oh, sorry, there was one other time when somebody literally tripped and fell into a bog, and they were called Pete after that. Because of Pete Bog. And so, I mean, there's just comedy to be had there. And some of the videos that go viral are nearly always people falling over. And there was a really muddy woodland walk recently where somebody's just giggling and giggling and giggling as they watch their younger brother try to stay stood up, knowing when we all knew it's coming. It's about a 3.5 minute film, but it's just hysterical because he keeps slipping, he slips some more, and it just keeps on giving beyond the comedy rule of 3, actually. It's just a brilliant viral video.
And I love this because in the world of coaching, if we're doing a coaching qualification or any training, the element of humor doesn't really come into it. We're not kind of encouraged to bring humor in, and we're not also even given necessarily any skills to deal with, okay, so what happens if? And I guess if you're indoors, apart from somebody saying something that might be a bit funny, because there isn't really that kind of element of movement which can lead to the slapstick, it might not come up as much. But when we're outdoor coaching, we've had previous guests on who've talked about everything from slipping in the mud, losing the soles of their shoes, getting their feet so wet that as they're walking they're literally squeaking as they're walking, and it's
squelch is a good word.
Squelch. and it just, as coaches, we have to be prepared, especially in that outdoor world, to be able to deal with that and to be able to stop it from causing a break in the coaching, but use it to facilitate the conversation and to allow people to release an emotion that maybe they weren't able to release before through laughter or even hysterics. You might have somebody who gets to the point of just letting it all go. And I just love the way that you described the oxygenating space as well, which you've mentioned your podcast there and the clearing, which we'd love to talk, find out a bit more about. And to me, that oxygenated space is the outdoors. You get so much more oxygenation and so much more pure, nice, good, clear air outdoors than you would necessarily in a room with 4 walls where you're, rebreathing each other's breath. So could you tell us a little bit more about your podcast and this concept of the clearing, which for me, the word the clearing conjures up images of the outdoors and being in a clearing or being in an outdoor space. But I know obviously it might not be the outdoors for people who conjure up their description of the clearing. So tell us a little bit more about it, and how can we as outdoor coaches maybe gain some insight from this process that you come up with for your podcast?
Well, the energetic intent of the clearing actually has its derivation in my love of comedy improvisation. and the fact that it's an empty space brimming and charged with potential where anything is possible. When you step onto a stage, when you're going to make some comedy up with a mindset and attitude of yes and, yes and, yes and, yes and you take that into the coaching arena where you give someone the mindset of yes and to just say, trust your instincts, go with what's next. When I then thought about it more deeply, I've always thought about coaching as being giving somebody a damn good listening to. So my podcast was born, The Good Listening To, the Story Behind Your Story show. But I couldn't get away from this idea of energetically placing it within the clearing, which is a place I step into when I forget about my own clutter and I focus really, with generous listening intent on the person that I'm coaching. So the clearing was born, and it's there's also a brilliant theatre company out there called Gifford Circus. I don't know if you've seen it. So in my mind, my clearing was sort of a straw-lit circus arena where you could play, clown, juggle, trapeze. I'm not a circus artist, but there's a recent guest with someone called Tweedy the Clown, who's one of the main energetic people within the clearing of Gifford Circus. So it was a combination of my own comedy improvisational stuff I'd seen. Anyway, the clearing was born. And so I asked my guests, what is a clearing like for you? Where is it, literally or metaphorically? It doesn't have to be a physical space. It often is. It can be, an outdoor space of choice. It could be a seascape. It could be a beach. It could, a forest in the thick of some long grass, a meadow, wherever. But interestingly, other people have taken it really laterally. Somebody said it's a doodle pad. And so what was really exciting for me as a comedy improvisation performer is that the whole conversation happened in a doodlescape. Somebody else said a flotation tank. It's where do you go to get clutter-free, inspirational and able to think? And then to your point about how to make that relatable to the outdoors, when you go outdoors, you've just got, the best clearing ever because you're just outdoors, and it is a clearing because you've moved away from your, conurbation of clutter. So there's an opportunity to just breathe a bit more deeply, coming back to the oxygenation idea, and just think, where do you go? And, we know psychologically there are quotes by people like Nietzsche, the best ideas happen outdoors. In my own life, it's very relatable because my bike is my freedom. There's sort of the movement towards. And so the podcast is about a movement towards, we're in your clearing, and I keep anchoring it in the clearing. But then we go off on other storytelling sorties, but within the scape of the clearing. And so my final question in the podcast is, as this has been your moment in the sunshine, here in the clearing, is there anything else you'd like to say? And that's a really good opportunity for anyone who thinks, oh, gosh, I really want to, I need to have remembered to say X. So I have that, again, it's a coaching intention, but I want to make sure that we sort of wring out the sponge of letting their thinking unfold. So I can riff for hours about what it's given me, the clearing, because there's real reciprocity in it. I just really genuinely enjoy giving people a good listening to. And if you don't mind me just riffing for a bit longer, it's a clearing, a tree, and because of my acting background, it's a bit Waiting for Godot-esque. I arrive with a sort of existential tree to shake your tree to see which storytelling apples fall out. And the exercise 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is the apples, metaphorically. I got this exercise from the lovely Dave Stewart, actually, whilst outdoors with him. And it's just a really beautiful storytelling exercise that, I'd encourage anyone listening to do with your people that you work alongside, love and learn alongside. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is where you've had 5 minutes, and I asked my guests to think about this, to have thought about 4 things that have shaped them, 3 things that inspire them, 2 things that never fail to grab your attention, and because of my comedy improvisational love, borrowed from the film Up, that's a bit, squirrels, what never fails to, the monsters of distraction. What are your squirrels that never fail to grab your attention? And then finally, a quirky or unusual fact about you we couldn't possibly know until you tell us. Then we stay in the clearing, move away from the tree, nearly finished. We talk about alchemy and gold. When you're at purpose and in flow, what do you most like bringing to the world? And then finally, I award you with a cake. And it's the final storytelling metaphor where you get to put a cherry on the cake, a favourite inspirational quote that's always given you succor and pulled you towards your future. What advice might you proffer to a younger version of yourself? And then finally, inspired by Shakespeare and all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, I'd like you to talk about legacy and how you'd most like to be remembered. So it's got this really lovely, really enjoyable, I just love it. And it's become my new passion project. And I wouldn't have even had the idea if it wasn't for the pandemic. So Anna Marie, earlier on, when you talked about how to plan your way through pockets of uncertainty, my work had completely gone off a cliff. And because the world just stopped and paused, which was weird, painful, seismic, really important now I know, because it allowed me to just recalibrate what else I could do in the skills that I have in terms of still following my passion. And even going back to my father's advice back in the day, I'm still following a path where I'm converging now into the clearing, but based on being an actor, facilitator, coach and comedy improvisation performer. Apologies, that was a bit of a monologue, but that's the sort of journey towards what the clearing realizes.
There's just so much in there. And I think the more I was listening to that, I was thinking, this is wonderful, because one of the things we often get asked, and we're very lucky, we get invited to present at workshops, mostly virtually at the moment, but hopefully in the future not so much, talking about, you know, the amazingness of outdoor coaching. And often the frequently asked questions we get are around tools and techniques that we can use in the outdoor space. And we often say, you know, any of your indoor tools and techniques you can use, but obviously when you're in the outdoors, you're partnering with nature. And how can you sort of bring nature into the conversation? And as you were describing your process there for your podcast, I'm thinking many of our listeners and our watchers will be thinking, I could sit with one of my clients and, you know, have a clearing and sit there and go through a very similar set of questions, or ask them. You know, we also have a lot of followers who actually coach virtually outdoors, and that's the kind of wonderful technique that they could use and really sort of make their own, where they are in one place outdoors and their client is somewhere totally different outdoors, but still have that connection and have that ability to work together alone, which is a wonderful phrase coined by one of our previous podcast guests,
Together alone. I love that. Yes.
Together alone. Just before we move on to talking a little bit more about your work with Dave, one other question that came to mind when you had mentioned talking there is this idea of moving forward. And we also talk a lot about movement in outdoor coaching. Yes, we're in, you know, it's an inclusive space, so you don't have to include movement in outdoor coaching. But one element of outdoor coaching that does differ quite significantly from indoor coaching is this ability to be able to move more freely. And I just thought it might be useful to get a little bit more insight from you about this, not just the metaphorical movement towards, but also the physical movement towards, and how that can really kind of, like, the outdoor space can help with that.
Sure, and actually one of the best examples of that I can think about immediately is the work with Dave Stewart and Fresh Air Leadership, whereby on a path from Bridge of Orkney to Ben Nevis, which happens over 4 days, we ascend a hill that sounds really scary, which is called the Devil's Staircase, which is probably familiar to you. But at the top of which, once you've got there, and it's not as bad as you think, it was to do with the army moving, I think, cannon or some heavy equipment up the Devil's Staircase. But it's not that bad, actually. And people feel really chuffed with themselves when they've moved literally up the Devil's Staircase. And it's got that beautiful, rich texture of storytelling, even attached to the ground on which you tread. But then when we get to the top, there's this most glorious escarpment, which in my head is we are at the base of Ben Nevis. It doesn't matter if we literally are or aren't, but there's another mountainscape and an escarpment. And then we've moved towards there. And then one of the most wonderful things to do in how I like to talk about presence and impact is use the construct of a line, I am Spartacus. And you do it 3 times. We go, I am Spartacus. And why I talk about Spartacus is accidentally a lot of people that we know live, work alongside, love alongside, seek validation in others a bit much, where they sort of say, rather than I am Spartacus, you'll see what I'm doing here, I am enough. They'll say, do you mind if I'm Spartacus? Am I Spartacus? Would it be okay with you guys? Oh, you're more senior than me. Do you mind if I'm Spartacus? So I get the whole group, normally a big leadership group of about sort of 12 to 15 people, to all start walking across the line and shouting to the world, I am Spartacus. And they do this to a mountainscape, and it's incredibly liberating because they've got a muscle memory of crossing the line to connect. And I often talk about in impact whether you will perceive people as being sort of behind the line, not quite really committing to who they are and what they're about, or they're on the line, nearly ready to sort of go, da-da, this is me. And then an old acting teacher once gave a fellow actor a really good note, which is embryonic performance love. give birth, would you? And it's this idea of commit. That was somebody called Nat Brenner. Very embryonic performance, Richard. Give birth, would you, love? It was a note to a fellow actor I stood alongside, and I loved it because it's about commitment. But anyway, the big punchline is to the final blam, sort of 9 out of 10 slam dunk. I am Spartacus, to the wilderness. And then you bring it back and you say, look, this is about self-advocacy. Just cross the line, and we can talk about confidence mantras. Just say to the world, I am Spartacus. In other words, I give myself permission. And just as a moment of movement, because we're literally doing a sort of 3 steps towards the mountainscape, it's just a wonderful muscle memory exercise. And, you know, I'm incredibly chuffed that I've walked away from that space a couple of times now as people are just walking and talking about it behind me, as we all walk together down thinking, blimey, that's an experience I'm never going to forget. And that gives me great succor, because you know that by being outdoors and, you know, giving people memories that they're, and even the person whose soul fell off, they're obviously not going to ever forget that, because of the exchange and it happened in their life. And it's a bit like, you know, in life, we all know in terms of influences in our life, people have said something to us we've never forgotten. I'm not trying to put myself in that same ballpark, but together as outdoor coaches, we can create a really, you know, unique set of oxygenated experiences that people never forget.
And I think this idea of, you know, as coaches, what experiences people then go through. And I just love to dive in a little bit with your work with Dave Stewart, because a lot of the kind of coaches we have with the conversations we have with coaches is very much one-on-one. The client conversations they have are one-on-one coaching. Clearly, you know, Dave Stewart, and if you've not checked out his episode, go and check it out. He does these more kind of experiential journeys through the landscape over a bigger period of time. You know, he's there, you're there, and it's just like a very different dynamic, this kind of co-coaching group style. And it would just be interesting, like, as a coach, how that is for you, kind of collaborating with Dave, like how you came on board, how you get the balance between the two of you, and then, you know, ultimately what benefits that then kind of moves on for the clients.
Well, it's the nature of ensemble, actually, because Dave Stewart, as with any coaching entity, is very good at the teamwork. The team you put together have different skills, you know, where I might end, Dave might begin. So, for example, I'm pretty poor at navigating and logistics, but luckily for me, Dave is just brilliant at that, and he's a wonderful coach and a really wonderful human being. So it's teamwork makes the dream work, and he has other, you know, really wonderful human beings who have extraordinary skills. You know, there's somebody called Joe Bradshaw, who's an Everest mountaineer who was there when the avalanche hit, I think 2016, if I've got my maths right, and she's a survivor of that. So she uses her leadership stories as a mountain guide. I talk about it from my own experience as an actor. You know, I'm intrigued by the human condition and behavior and the choices that we might make pertaining to our physical presence or our vocal presence moment to moment. And I'm really aware that I bring a skill set in that scenario that others wouldn't have. And so it's the yin and the yang of the right personalities to make a leadership journey or quest just feel really rounded. And then what happens is you're walking with the group, the rhythm of the group, walking at a really relaxed pace. You know, to be really clear, you know, Dave doesn't do mountaineering boot camping. This is just a group doing, actually, you know, the West Highland Way is a beautiful walk, but it's actually quite gentle. So people can find a group rhythm, which is really important in group coaching, because people literally just ebb and flow. And I know I'm doing a podcast, but I'm doing something visual for you, where you just sort of drop in, drop behind, walk forward, drop behind. We're obviously planted quite carefully, you know, the front, the back and the middle, obviously to take care of the group. But the group rhythm, it's not a race. The group rhythm is just really profound, and there's breath that begins to happen, and the group find their breath almost, which is unique each time you do it. And it's just fascinating to just observe and a privilege to participate in helping someone's thinking unfold as the landscape unfolds.
It's just so lovely to hear such rich experiences and examples that are very different to the ones we've had from our other guests so far as well. And this is why we love to invite such different guests onto our podcast, because, you know, we get just such a wealth of insight and a wealth of storytelling. And obviously you're a very good storyteller, and that's the richness of the learning for for our listeners. And as we have listeners who are already outdoor coaches, but we also have a lot who are coming to this new, and it might be something that they're excited about and they've heard about, or they thought, oh, I'd love to mix my love of the outdoors with my coaching practice. Is that possible? And I've started to realize absolutely, and it's a wonderful way to practice outdoor coaching. Just as we're starting to wrap up, we could honestly talk to you for hours. Just as we're starting to wrap up for today, are there any resources or suggestions that you could give to our listeners, both coaches who have been doing it for some time and or people who are new to this wonderful world of outdoor coaching that we live in?
One resource that I forgot to mention and must mention about what Dave Stewart also has done, which I've learnt from, is he uses topography really brilliantly on these walks. So, for example, as a resource, because I'm answering both here, there is a moment at the beginning of the walk where we all walk to a big boulder that he's found, which is called the storytelling rock. So you go and do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise as an early part of the group's journey at the storytelling rock, quite close to the Bridge of Orkney. It's the first time that people put their boots on a hill to just think, oh gosh, where am I? And they'll step into a bit of boggy terrain in order to get to a storytelling rock. So finding resources symbolically for yourself, even if you're doing cityscape walk coaching or outdoor walk coaching, just be really observant about what's around you that you can then use to help you and enable your journey towards. So that's a big resource. Use nature as your biggest resource is my best advice, because I mentioned earlier on, my bike is my freedom. My resource is a local part of Ashton Court in Bristol, my geography, where I nearly always cycle to with my coffee flask, and I'll normally sit and record a LinkedIn film in my promontory, as I call it. I've got 2 or 3 promontories within Bristol that I've stumbled upon as my own personal resources about where I go to be resourced and to share what's on my mind. Then if you want more tangible resources from the point of view of what I'd recommend in the work that I do, the best book about how to get the best from relationships around you is one that everybody's heard of, but it really is good. It's How to Win Friends and Influence People, the Dale Carnegie book. Once you've got over a little bit of American cheese, it's actually just a brilliant book because it's very, very accessible. And just a bit of personal disclosure, I'm pretty terrible at textbooks, but that is one that I read from cover to cover, and it's well thumbed. And even, it's going to change soon, but my current LinkedIn banner says it's all about the relationship, stupid. And my favourite word, even going back to Stan Laurel, in my mindset is about influencing is reciprocity. Also linked to my father as well. He didn't know Dale Carnegie, obviously, but I remember about that book. It was the first book of its kind ever written, and the best. And it was published in 1938. And why I remember that is my dad was born in 1937. And so it's an airport read. It's there all the time, but it really is a good book. How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie.
And thank you for sharing those kind of resources that we will signpost in the show notes to this episode, and also just kind of tagging on another kind of tool and technique for our coaches. I know that just having a range of them that people can draw from is absolutely priceless for their coaching, and then people often take them and add their own spin to them, make them theirs, and it's all about that constant kind of evolution. And wow, what a journey. And I was so intrigued when Alex was like, yeah, we're going to get Chris on, we're going to have a bit of laughter. And it's just like, oh, and actually as a fundamental human emotion, it's something that it's kind of been lost. We're kind of losing our sense of humor and just being far too kind of serious. So yeah, the gift of a giggle and a little bit of a sultry smile is what it's all about.
I love that. And by the way, could I mention one other thing about a workshop that happens once a year, which is so exciting, which might be of interest to you as well. It's linked to the outdoors, you'll be happy to hear. But in France, in southwest France, in a place called Vertiac, I do Instant Wit, which is my comedy improvisation company, Instant Wit Laughter Lab at a place called Vertiac in France, run by a wonderful expat British woman who looks a bit like Judi Dench, so I sort of loved her when I first met her. But it's called lesursanglais.com, which in layperson's term is the French translation of the English sisters, les sœurs anglaises. And we explore the mindset of yes and comedy improvisation, but in a place that's so beautiful. It's surrounded on 3 sides by sunflowers. And, we walk around the grounds, arm in arm, linked in pairs, doing things like one-word stories to get us to realise and appreciate just how truly easy it is to be spontaneous. And you can do that when you're on walks as well, actually. Get people to just riff and tell one-word stories and have a bit of a play with some comedy improvisational strategies as well.
And the whole yes and in itself, because often it's a no but. So it's just
that is the absolute.
Waiting.
Yeah, we are so hardwired, particularly as grown-ups. Watch children, watch animals, particularly dogs. They're so monumentally present. It's now. Squirrels, now, shiny. Yes and, yes and, yes and. But as human beings, we're really, really, unfortunately, a bit hardwired to no but. And so that's why yes and as a training principle is incredibly liberating. The difference between what you want and what you get in life is what you do, and yes and yes and yes and can help you get there, I think.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think just for the rest of the day, I'm going to have this "I am Spartacus."
Try it. It's awesome. You are Spartacus, and just listen to how many people go. Can I mention the training and development stuff as well? Am I allowed to sort of crank me handles as to where you can find out more about me, or is that something you do later? Oh, you did a lovely nod at me, Alexandra. Thank you very much. Now, dear, go now. They mean now. Yes. So my training, coaching and development space, I have a comedy improvisation company called Instant Wit. That's instantwit.co.uk. That's where I'm doing my laughter and my great passion projects. And then secondcurve.uk is my training company. And within Second Curve, there's a podcast button. And if you want to get involved in my podcast, there are various series strands which can help you do that. Whereby I can help people to amplify their story, amplify their brand, either personally or professionally. Also, if you're a leader, you can share your leadership reflections. I've struck on as I mentioned, the shape of it. It's become very versatile, and I can take people down, rabbit holes of their choosing if they like. So another series strand is called Good Books, where people in the clearing I've described end up with a metaphorical plinth where they put their book on it, and then they can tell us all about their new book to reach a broader audience as well. And you're going to be writing a book, just to give you a handle, aren't you, Alexandra and Anna Marie? And Twitter, it's at that Chris Grimes. Twitter at that Chris Grimes. And by the way, thank you so much. I've stunned you into silence. You're both just looking at me thinking, has he finished yet? So,
No, not at all. And just thank you for adding all those different resources at the end there, which just can take our listeners off in so many different ways, which is what it's all about, encouraging people to find, little nuggets that they can then take away and make their own and go off and do their own research. So, no, thank you for being so generous with your time. And I suspect there's going to be an episode 2 follow up at some point.
I'd be so delighted to do that. And congratulations to you both for being up to episode 26. It's a good old long journey, isn't it? And by the way, to your point, Anna Marie, what I so enjoy about the best ideas of all of what you're up to, definitely, and what I'm up to as well, is the idea that I love the idea that you're going to go off and let things percolate and the dust settle, because coaching at its best is about agitating people's thinking, not to disturb you or mess with your head, but just to get you to think differently and think anew. So if I've agitated your thinking in some way, then boom, drop the mic, good night. It's all good.
If you hear any Iron Spartacus is on the kind of Avon Canal later, that'll be me this afternoon.
And I'd love to walk with you someday. That would just be wonderful, by the way.
Yeah, no, definitely. Particularly Southwest Coaches Outdoors. It's kind of that's what it's all about as well, building the network of coaches and then seeing what emerges from there. So yeah, thank you, Chris, so much for being on and giving us something different. That's what the series has all been about. People who've been listening in, love to hear your thoughts about this kind of idea of kind of comedy, the clearing. What about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1? There's a bit of cake in there as well, which is always to be encouraged. Thinking kind of what's your alchemy, opening it up to legacy. So rich. There's just so many different ideas.
Yes,
so
and that is the
good
listening to the Story Behind Your Story show, wherever you get your podcasts. That's the really important thing. That's obviously the most important passion project where all those storytelling metaphors pervade. So the good listening to the Story Behind Your Story show. also called Your Life and Times with me, Chris Grimes, just to give myself a bit of a handle in there as well. But at the top of my
and
tree,
why not? Bit of self-promotion.
Yeah, the top of my tree is Michael Palin. I'm hoping that someday, when you both listen to me interviewing Michael Palin, and I'm about to hit episode 100 now, and I'm sort of on the path of trying to find Michael Palin.
Yeah, we'll get there. Quarter of the way there. Give us a few more years, and we'll be there. No, the podcast journey in itself has been so rewarding, just meeting so many people. And just, if you're listening in and you haven't checked out our back catalogue, please do head back and definitely check out the episode of Dave Stewart. We've kind of mentioned his name a couple of times, so it'd be good just to kind of broaden your knowledge there, but also the whole kind of catalogue of other guests. So yeah, hopefully you've already checked out our website, coaching-outdoors.com, coaching-outdoors.com. And for us today, that is a wrap.
So if you enjoyed what you've heard, like it, share across your network,
and subscribe to our YouTube channel and LinkedIn community page, the Coaching Outdoor Podcast.
Thanks so much in advance for your support.